Hello, everyone. You just missed my awesome introduction, which was describing how Seminole County is working to have healthy yards while having clean waterways. In Seminole County, we passed our Fertilizer Ordinance at the end of February, and since then, we've been trying to get the word out however we can to learn the correct way to fertilize while having minimal impacts on our waterways. So this is the first of 3 webinars. Today we're going to focus solely on fertilizers, and then the next webinars will look at some issues connected to yard maintenance and how that will still impact our waterways. So let's jump right in to an introduction of the Florida Friendly Program. In 2009, the Florida legislator realized that our front yards and our backyards, when we add it all together, does have a big impact on the surrounding environment. So we want to make sure that we take care of our yards in a way that doesn't overuse water or create pollution or erosion, instead potentially providing wildlife habitat. And to do that, we have 9 principles to come together. So a Florida-friendly yard can look very different since different parts of Florida have very different environmental conditions and very different plant selections in their landscape. So first we think about what the right plant is for the right place. Maybe turf isn't exactly the right plant for the yard conditions that you have, and then from there we figure out the best way to maintain the landscape that you most enjoy. So we talk about watering efficiently, the benefits of mulch. Today we're really focusing in on how to fertilize appropriately, because if we get that wrong, we really do stress out our waterways. Other classes talk about recycling, such as using compost, how to attract wildlife based on the plants you have and how they're arranged. Some wildlife we consider pests, so we have to eliminate those pests without harming anything we never meant to harm. Then reducing stormwater runoff is actually a big issue in order to preserve our water quality. We'll talk about that more in this webinar, and ultimately protecting the waterfront, which will be the focus of our final webinar in this series. Hopefully it's not a hard sell for you guys to appreciate the importance of having good, clean water quality. For one, we want to drink, bathe, interact in water that doesn't pose any risks to our health. Besides us humans, wildlife, of course, are highly dependent on healthy waterways to live and drink and interact in as well. And potentially we want to observe that wildlife, recreate on those waterways, canoe, swim, fish, and even if that's none of our favorite activities in Seminole County throughout Florida, a lot of that recreation brings in a lot of revenue. So having good water quality supports our county. And yet, we live in a pretty urbanized county, and like I said before, our yards are closely connected to our waterways. So the ordinance came about to know when, with what products, and how much to fertilize, because what happens in our yards does potentially end up in our water. So we need to fertilize the right way to have a healthy grass and clean water. So they're not conflicting with one another if we just make certain precautions and do things correctly. So some people might think, I don't live anywhere near a waterway, how am I having an effect on it? But we're all interconnected through something called the watershed. All land is broken up into watersheds. And when it rains, what happens at the different pieces of these lands all comes and mixes together. The water either soaks into the ground or flows downhill and into the nearest waterway that ultimately connects into our major waterways. So if you're looking at this picture, you can imagine what sort of pollutants a factory or a pasture might produce and how water will move that around. And then we have our own neighborhoods producing certain types of pollutants. Stormwater is what connects everything together. And so how we fertilize, how we maintain our vehicles, potentially will end up in our waterways as they move across, as the rainwater moves across impervious surfaces like asphalt and concrete cement. It runs off down the drains, down the gutters, into our nearest waterway. So the stormwater is picking up trash and grass clippings, pet waste, pesticides, household chemicals. Our septic tanks are also loaded with rich nutrients that ultimately can become a pollutant. So the most common pollutants that we deal with are actually nitrogen and phosphorus, which show up in our soils naturally, as well as when we additionally add our fertilizers. Pet waste carries bacteria. Grass clippings also carry bacteria. Sediments are different dust and soil particles caused by erosion, get moved around and enter our waterways, as well as other toxic organics, oils from our cars, pesticides, again, those household chemicals. We became very curious about what was stressing out our waterways. So the Wekiva River, one of our major outstanding and scenic, a federal designation, waterways, was tested about where the different nutrients that were polluting the waterways were coming from. So they tracked different isotopes and they presented this information in this chart right here. So septic tanks are a big contributor, but if you have a septic tank or know anything about them, retrofitting or removing a septic tank is a high cost item. We also found out that fertilizers do play a big role with the nitrogen loading into our waterways. Part of that's agriculture. They have their own best management practices to try to lower that. Golf courses play a small role, and then us right here, we add 15% of the nitrogen into our waterways. And so education, just trying to do the right thing, we feel is one of the most cost-effective things to help reduce the nitrogen in our waterways and thus improve the water quality. Because the chain of events starts with our nitrogen and phosphorus. When you have sunlight, water, nitrogen, and phosphorus, you have everything you need for aquatic weeds and algae to grow. So as long as the nitrogen and phosphorus are available, the water quality can decrease with the growing algae. Ultimately, that algae can create pea soup colored water. It reduces the water clarity. And as that algae lives and breathes and then dies, it starts to consume oxygen. When oxygen levels get too low, that's when we have our fish kills. And at that point, a scummy pond with a bunch of dead fish, you don't really want to recreate and interact with this waterway anymore, and we lose the value that this water body once offered. And Seminole County has a combination of waterways and a lot of people. So here are some stats. We have over 2,000 lakes and ponds that make up about 15% of our county. Lake Jessup, Lake Harney, our big lakes in our county. And then we have some significant rivers, the Wekiva, the St. Johns. We have 13 major springs, and all of that is mixed in with over 220,000 households. So we're an urban county with some valuable waterways, and that's what's creating the potential conflict of stormwater running all around and getting our waterways impaired. So you can imagine that this is what I was leading up to. A lot of our waterways, what's indicated in red, are impaired, and it's not from heavy metals or nuclear waste or anything too scary, but it's nitrogen and phosphorus putting the ecosystem out of balance, and sometimes our waterways are also infected with fecal chloroform or E. coli. So from here, we're going to focus on our lawns and how we can feed our lawns, get them at their healthiest, at their maximums, without letting any excess nutrients end up in our waterway. I'm going to focus on turf, but I first need to mention the other landscape plants. So this is the one slide I'll talk about landscape plants on. There's a bunch of different plants that we can have in our yard, and some of them have more specific nutrient requirements. The Seminole County Fertilizer Ordinance applies to all landscape areas. All landscapers have to follow the ordinance. But some plants might have special requirements. So one example is that palm trees need a fair amount of manganese and magnesium and other micronutrients, as well as its own levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. Potentially, you can fertilize your palm while respecting the slow release requirements that we'll talk about and the summer restrictions for palms. But other edibles, other like citrus and other roses, azaleas, and other plants with particular needs might show signs of deficiency that will need a particular nutrient. So all you have to do is go to UF IFAS recommendations, rely on what the University of Florida has figured out what the nutrient requirements are. It's really interesting that you can start to see signs of deficiencies depending on how the leaves of the plant discolor. Sometimes the oldest leaves will discolor before the newer leaves, and that might be a sign of a particular nutrient deficiency. All these signs and clues are something that our master gardeners at our help desk or our plant clinic are trained to diagnose. So if you suspect any nutrient deficiency in your landscape plants, come to our office, we can confirm that, and then we can give you specific recommendations on how best to fertilize them. Another quick note is about weed and feeds. So weed and feeds are not mentioned in the Seminole County Fertilizer Ordinance, but they are not recommended by the University of Florida. The appealing thing about weed and feeds would be that you get to fertilize your yard and remove your weeds in one fell swoop, get it done and out of the way. I like to think of it as hitting two birds with one stone, but in actuality, most people can't hit two birds with one stone. And the reality is that a lot of times our weed problems do not perfectly align with our fertilizer needs. For example, it's probably best for you to apply a pre-emergent herbicide that kills weed seeds before they even sprout, but you need to get them generally before February 15th, and February 15th is not a time you would want to be fertilizing. The second thing is you want to spot treat weeds. You only want to put the minimal amount of herbicide where the weed problem is rather than spreading it throughout your whole landscape. So when you're shopping for your fertilizers, we recommend skipping the weed and feeds. We don't recommend purchasing them. So I've been telling you about the potential harm that can result to our waterways, but that's not to say that turf isn't a team player to reduce pollution. Turf can do a lot to slow down the stormwater runoff. Its interwoven root system will filter out and use the nutrients we apply. That reduces leaching, which is when the nutrients soak downward into the groundwater. It reduces erosion, and through that we can protect our groundwater, as well as that living plant will produce oxygen. So we just need to make sure we do what we can to make our turf healthy without releasing nutrients that the turf can't absorb. Fertilizer is really just one piece of the puzzle in the grand scheme of a healthy lawn. So our next webinar is really going to focus in how to irrigate and mow correctly. Potentially, if you have these wrong, you're having an unhealthy turf grass, and the more you fertilize can potentially stress it out more. It's not going to solve the problem. So our next webinar is going to give you a lot more information on that. But today we're going to talk about how to fertilize the right way, what to use, when to use it, and how much you need to apply. So, fertilizer is plant food, what the plants need in order to grow, and so photosynthesis is a key part of that, which involves carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Luckily, those elements are available in our air. What we need from the soil includes our macro and our micronutrients. So the macronutrients are what we need in the largest quantities. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then micronutrients are just as important, but they're not needed in nearly the same volume as the macronutrients. And so those are iron, boron, zinc, etc. Generally, our soils will provide these nutrients. Sometimes we need to give them a boost if our soils are deficient, and we can do that with fertilizers. So those essential macronutrients, the three main ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So nitrogen is a part of a lot of proteins in your plants. Pretty much all proteins need nitrogen, as well as a critical part of chlorophyll, which is what makes our plants green. And so we need nitrogen for plant growth, and it'll create a green lawn. Phosphorus is also important for our landscape plants. It's important for flowering and fruiting and for establishment. The thing is that phosphorus is generally in high enough quantities in our soil already, so there's no need to add any more to it. And then potassium, you don't see much action happening above ground with our grass blades. All the action is happening below ground. It's all about strengthening the roots when we apply potassium, which is really important. The roots are what, if you have a strong root system, that's what's going to survive times of stress. The strong root system increases disease resistance and cold tolerance. Potassium, as of right now, we can pour potassium in our waterways and not see any effect. It's nitrogen and phosphorus that cause that chain reaction we talked about earlier, where algae and nuisance weeds go out of control. So you want to know what your soil is already providing, and a soil test is what you can get and learn about your lawn. So at our office, you can learn the soil pH. We'll talk about that in just a second, or you can send it off to our lab in Gainesville. There's other local labs, which will also tell you the level of phosphorus. This is going to be really important because if you suspect you have a phosphorus deficiency, the soil test will confirm that. It can tell you potassium and magnesium levels as well, but it won't be able to tell you nitrogen. Nitrogen is just too mobile in our soils. You can get a soil test today and then a soil test tomorrow, and your nitrogen levels will be different. So you would need a tissue test if you're suspecting you have a nitrogen deficiency. Getting back to the pH, most of our turf grasses can handle a pretty broad range of pHs, and most likely this won't be too much of a concern for the turf you have or that you're interested in, but depending on your pH, different nutrients become available. So if you look here at iron, iron is pretty available at acidic temperatures, and as we move down and have more alkaline temperatures, it becomes less available. So if you know your soil pH and you can say that you have alkaline soils, you can guess that you might have iron deficiencies. You might need to add iron to make up for that. So let's get back to nitrogen and phosphorus, since those are the potential pollutants and what your turf needs to grow. There's two forms of nitrogen: quick release and slow release. Quick release we've used historically. It comes in the forms of urea, ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate. It's quick release because it's immediately available to your plants. And so you apply it to your grass and you can visibly see a difference relatively soon. It also will cause your grass to green up and grow faster. But because it's so immediately available, it's also very quick to escape into the surrounding environment. It'll turn into gas. The minute it rains, it's going to dissolve and wash away. And so what I think of is those game shows where you can stand in a tube and then they start pouring money, but they also blast hurricane winds. And you have just that limited amount of time to try to grab as much money as you can. That's what quick release is. You can get a lot of nitrogen, but it's not going to last in your yard. Instead, it's probably going to end up in our waterways. Meanwhile, we also have slow release nitrogen. Slow release nitrogen is just locked up in some way. Organically, it's in more complex compounds, so those chemical bonds need to break in some way for the nitrogen to become available, or in a fertilizer facility, they might put like a polymer shell on it that would need to dissolve. And so as that nitrogen gets released over a longer period of time, it's more on pace with nature and the plants are able to absorb it. It's more efficient. And it's also available for a longer time in your yard. So we're about to talk about our summer restrictions. If you use slow release nitrogen, there's going to be nitrogen available to your turf through the summer. And ultimately that means less nitrogen entering our lakes and our other water bodies, which is a good thing. So the state of Florida has designated a maximum amount of nitrogen you can put on your yard. For a slow release product, you can put down a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet at any one time. So this is a critical piece of information that's going to come back into play when we calculate how much fertilizer you need to put down. The second part of the ordinance is that you need a phosphorus-free fertilizer. So you shouldn't have any phosphorus in your soils. Plants need phosphorus, but our soils are already giving the plants all the phosphorus that they need. There are definitely pockets in Seminole County where for some reason you have low amounts of phosphorus, so that's when you get your soil test. You can prove that you have low amounts of phosphorus, and then you're allowed to add phosphorus to your soils through fertilizer. The thing is that we need to try really hard to keep phosphorus out of our waterways because it's the limiting nutrient in our lakes. Essentially, if we could keep all the phosphorus out, then the algae doesn't have that critical piece it needs to grow. So what I have pictured here is some data that came from the Seminole County Water Atlas. Basically, any lake in Seminole County has a water quality index and a lot of parameters that you can look and see. If you're curious, look up your nearest lake, and what you will see is a part that says limiting nutrient, which is either nitrogen or phosphorus. More often it's phosphorus, which means that any additional phosphorus in the system is going to enable a lot more algae to grow. The example I use here is if you want to bake a cake or you want to bake a lot of cakes, you might have a ton of flour, you might have a ton of sugar, but if you only have a dozen eggs, that's going to determine how many cakes you have. And if you have any more eggs, you can definitely make a lot more cakes. And so in this case, phosphorus is the eggs. We want to keep phosphorus out of our waterways. So buy a fertilizer that doesn't have any phosphorus in it. Your grass will be fine because there's enough phosphorus in the soils. So we need to time the fertilizer correctly because rainfall can wash our fertilizers away in the form of runoff or in the form of leaching. So runoff, it moves horizontally over the landscape into the nearest waterway, or leaching, it moves downward into our groundwater. And so as Floridians, we're probably used to the forecast like we had a couple weeks ago when every day we had that thunderstorm icon. And if it's going to rain within 24 hours of you applying fertilizers, basically your time and money is washing down the drain and polluting our waterways. So Seminole County went ahead and created a summer restriction time during our rainy season. And so you're no longer allowed to use a fertilizer that has nitrogen or phosphorus June through September. And so that summer restriction just ended. You can now use nitrogen and nitrogen um, fertilizers in and slow release form starting now through May. During the restricted period, you are allowed to use summer blends. And so you'll see some fertilizers out there that don't have nitrogen or phosphorus. Instead, they have iron and micronutrients. What iron does is help your grass stay green. The iron is another essential part of chlorophyll, and so that makes your plants green. Iron is not the same as nitrogen, but during the summer, if you feel like your grass needs some green up, a summer blend fertilizer that has the iron and micronutrients might give you that color response that you would like. And so you also want to apply fertilizers when the turf grass has the capacity to absorb those nutrients. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that during the spring and summer, you got your warm weather and you got your rain, and so the turf grass has a pretty strong root system. And then naturally, as it gets drier and cooler, the root system dies off. So you don't necessarily want to apply fertilizers when you don't have the root capacity. Even though you're allowed to apply in the winter, that's not a good time for fertilizers. But generally, you're going to apply twice a year. You're going to apply in April so that your turf grass will have that nitrogen available through the summer, and then you'll apply it again in the fall. That's basically now in October. Do it early in October so that it'll last through the winter season. In October, you're going to make sure that you have enough potassium to strengthen that root system. So generally, a ratio where the nitrogen equals the potassium in the fall. And then there's the new sod situation. So since we just talked about root capacity, you can guess that new sod does not have a really developed root system. It hasn't had the chance to develop one yet. So you're not allowed to fertilize new sod within the first 30 days. This is nothing for you to worry about because the sod farms generally fertilize their sod really well. It has enough fertilizer to get it through that 30-day prohibited period. You could probably go a lot longer before having to apply fertilizers. Let that root system develop because that's what's going to absorb the nutrients. So let's look more closely at the fertilizer product that you're going to buy because that's going to determine whether it's a quick or slow release nitrogen product and then how much you're allowed to put down. On your fertilizer bag, sometimes they'll be broadcasted right on the front of the bag in big numbers, or maybe it's on the back in a smaller section, but you'll see 3 numbers that are always in the same order. Nitrogen is the first one, the middle one is phosphorus, and the last one is potassium. So when you look at those 3 numbers, what you want to consider is that this middle number is now a 0 because you can't apply phosphorus. And like I just mentioned, in the fall, I would have the first number be the same as the last number so that the percent nitrogen equals the percent potassium. Then you have to look at the label, and this label can be kind of intimidating. There's a lot of chemical names on there, but I need you to look at 2 things. I need you to look at the total nitrogen, which is generally one of the first numbers, and then usually skim down and get to the bottom where it'll say the percent that is slowly available nitrogen. in Seminole County, you need a product that is at least 50% slow release nitrogen. So look again at that label, find your total, and find your slowly available and see if that's half. You take the slow release, you divide it by the total nitrogen. And if that's 50 or greater, then you're good to go. If it's less than 50, this is a quick release product and you're not allowed to apply it in Seminole County. When you've selected your fertilizer, you need to figure out how much you're putting down and how many times. This chart here is produced from the University of Florida. Basically, if you have Bahia grass, you've got it easy. They've done studies where they apply a lot of fertilizer and they apply very little fertilizer, and basically Bahia looks just as good with no fertilizer than it does with fertilizer. If you really want to, you can apply a pound of nitrogen, but you're pretty much good to go. Meanwhile, they see the best response and healthiest turf grass in St. Augustine and zoysia grass if you put down 2 pounds of nitrogen a year. And since you're only allowed to apply 1 pound of nitrogen each time, that means 2 times a year, 1 in April, 1 in October, and you're good to go. So, how much is 1 pound of slow release nitrogen? This, again, if we think about baking a cake, how much cake can you eat if you're only allowed to really consume maybe 2 teaspoons of sugar? The way you figure out how many pounds of fertilizer you need to get 1 pound of slow release nitrogen is you take the total percent nitrogen, that first of the 3 numbers, and divide it by 100. That's how many pounds of fertilizer you need. The other thing you need to know is how big your yard is, because the pounds of fertilizer you need is based on 1,000 square feet. So I have no idea how big your yard is. You're going to have to figure that out. So basically it's length times width. If you have a measuring tape, you can go out and measure that right now. You don't have to get too complicated trying to figure out any triangles or trapezoids. Just do your general length times width in your yard. That's how many square feet you have. You have to divide that by 1,000 and then multiply that by the pounds of fertilizer you calculated. So let's say you realized you need to apply 4 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. If you have a 2,000 foot yard, that means 8 pounds of fertilizer. If you want another way to calculate the size of your yard, since you're on this webinar, you might also feel comfortable using Google Maps. You can zoom in on your property, and they have a feature where you sort of click in the shape of your yard, and from there it'll calculate that area for you. The other method you can use is visualizing it as best you can. A parking space is about 100 square feet, and a volleyball court is about 1,000 square feet, or half a volleyball court rather. So think how many parking spaces or volleyball courts you can fit into your yard, and that's an estimate of your square footage. The whole process is determining whether you have a 50% slow release product. By that, you need to see if the slow release percentage is half of the total nitrogen. If that's the case, you take that total nitrogen percentage and divide it into 100. Then you calculate the area of your yard. You divide that by 1,000 and take the pounds of fertilizer here divided by that yard area for the total amount of fertilizer. If you're feeling a little lost, we figured you might be, and so we developed a fertilizer calculator to do all that math for you. You need to just tell us 3 things. You need to look at your bag of fertilizer and find the total nitrogen percentage and put that here. You need to enter your slow release nitrogen and put that there. From there, the calculator will tell you whether this is a product you can use, whether it meets that 50% slow release standard, and how much fertilizer you need per 1,000 square feet. So finally, you tell us how big your yard is, and it'll tell you the amount of fertilizer you need to put down. will try out this calculator if there's enough time. It's mobile friendly, it's for free. Just go to that website and you can try it for yourself. To make things a little more complicated, if you have reclaimed water, you're already putting nitrogen and phosphorus on your turf grass when you water your yard. And so if you calculated that you need, let's say 11 pounds of fertilizer, if you have reclaimed water, it's less than that. What we're working towards is being able to tell you this is the amount of nitrogen in your water based on where you live, and factoring that in so we can tell you exactly how much fertilizer you need to reach that 2 pounds of nitrogen in a year. If you have reclaimed water, you would know because the piping's purple. There's generally signage because you don't want to drink this water. It hasn't been properly treated because it still has some waste products, including nitrogen and phosphorus, in your water. Let's just wrap up by talking about how to apply your fertilizer. When you know the total amount of fertilizer you need, you take half of that, you put it in your spreader, and you walk in horizontal lines. Then perhaps you've walked too slowly or too quickly because you have some fertilizer left over or you used it up too soon. You adjust your pace and walk then in vertical distances. So you'll get good coverage this way, and use your fertilizer correctly. Once you apply your fertilizer, you need to water it in just a 1/4 of an inch of water, get it settled in the soil, and then it's in there ready to go. The other thing you need to do with your spreader is use the Deflector Shield. The Deflector Shield just helps you guide where the fertilizer is going a bit better. This is especially important when you're walking along sidewalks. You don't want the fertilizer on the sidewalks. It's just going to wash away. If that happens, sweep it back into your spreader and keep going. Another reason the Deflector Shield is important is that you have to stay at least 15 feet away from the waterfront. So if you are fertilizing near a shoreline, maybe a retention pond or your lakefront, you can't fertilize closer than 15 feet. It's just too close to the water. It's going to get in there. And generally you walk at a 3-mile-per-hour speed. All right, so that is how you fertilize your yard. By this point, I hope you know that nitrogen and phosphorus are pollutants in our waterways. You need to get a soil test to see the phosphorus levels in your yard, and then potentially, if you have St. Augustine and zoysia grass, you apply a pound of slow-release nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in April and October. Water it in a 1/4 of an inch and keep fertilizer as well as grass clippings on the lawn, not on pervious surfaces. So, like I was referring to in the webinar, fertilizer is just one piece of the puzzle if you want the healthiest turf grass, and the healthiest turf grass is really what's going to have the best capacity to absorb nutrients as well as other pollutants. So same time next week, Tuesday at 10 a.m., we're going to talk about reducing nutrients in the landscape. We're going to talk about how to irrigate, how to mow. We're going to talk about grass clippings as well as some plant selection. So we hope you can make that as well. From here, we'll address any questions in the chat box, and I'm also going to very quickly pull up that fertilizer calculator so you can see it in action.
All right, Taryn, in the chat box so far, we have Keith asking if we have any fertilizer brand recommendations.
So when you're going into your gardening supply store, you are going to have a big selection that's going to quickly get narrowed down. First off, you're going to start eliminating things that have phosphorus. You're going to eliminate your weed and feeds. And then what's going to require a little more closer inspection is whether it's a quick or slow release product. We can't give you any specific brand recommendations. We're not meant to endorse any product over the other. So that's going to be your selection process. So um, what I also want to show you guys right now is that fertilizer calculator that hopefully you should see as part of your webinar. Let's say you are in the store, you find nitrogen products that's 15%. And let's say you look and you see that it's 8% slow release nitrogen. From here, you have to click the cursor into this greenish gold box, and it tells you that it's a slow release product. You'll need about 6.7 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And let's say your yard is 1,300 square feet. Again, put your cursor in the box, and it tells you the total amount of fertilizer you need for your yard. So it's pretty simple. What we need you to do is figure out how big your yard is and then look at the label of the fertilizer bag to put in those total nitrogen and slow release percentages. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I think we're good to go. Thanks so much, guys, for tuning in, and I hope to see you next week.